My guest today is Dr. Jaime Pineda, a professor of cognitive science, neuroscience, and psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego. He's also the author of many widely cited papers in human cognitive and systems neuroscience. In today's episode, Dr. Pineda talks about his new book, Controlling Mental Chaos, Harnessing the Power of the Creative Mind. This book teaches you 4 highly effective strategies for shutting down our uncontrolled thoughts and finding a place of deep creativity and calmness. Welcome to Psychology.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to it.
I am as well. I mean, we all have experienced so much chaos in our life, and so I'm looking forward to hearing how you can help us control that. But before we get started, though, what drew you to the world of psychology?
Yeah, well, started when I was 9 years old. I came to the U.S. at 9 years old, and in order to do that, I had to leave my parents, my family, my culture, my language, to find a better education, basically. But that began my questioning of, what defines my identity, because I found myself in a brand new place. I had to find a new identity, basically. And so questions about identity have always been in the background of my mind. And I got interested in psychology because of that. I wanted to know, what makes me who I am, why do I behave the way I am, et cetera. And so my undergrad degree is in psychology. But then psychology wasn't enough for me because it didn't really answer the questions I was after. So I decided I need to study the hardware part of what makes me who I am. I need to study the brain and how the brain generates the mind. And so I got a PhD in neuroscience, trying to get after those questions. So that's how it came about. And then the neuroscience itself wasn't enough.
I needed, all right, sir.
Science was good up to a point, and then I decided that I needed more of a more subjective sort of understanding of the mind. And so I began a 30-year process of contemplative practices. So I've been involved in contemplative practices for 30 years. And so my interest is really understanding the mind, the brain, how it all works, but both from a science and a subjective perspective.
Correct. Yes. And so for those of you who don't know what the contemplative aspects are, the studies he's talking about is more mysticism, more spirituality, more something greater than our physical body right now. So you kind of connect all that together, which is fantastic. Now, to come to the States at 9 years old, I can't imagine how that was. I mean, my gosh, the resilience you must have been, born out of that or came out of that. I can't imagine how powerful that was for you. Do you often use that? Or do you often go back and reflect about that 9-year-old boy, how his mentality was, what kind of caused him to be the person he is today?
Oh, absolutely. I remember that I cried for about a week, after I realized I didn't have everybody that I knew wasn't around me. But I think it gave me that kind of resiliency that you're talking about. It gave me a certain strength after I got over the pain of it. I realized that I had to sort of find my own voice, find my own set of, my own strength and that kind of thing. So that it really was helpful.
Do you talk about, or just a little off topic here, but do you talk about, or do you ever really focus on resilience? What causes resilience? Because we all have it. Sometimes it's activated at different times, and sometimes it's not. But we all have it within our psyche. Do you ever think about or talk about that? What causes the resilience? What causes it to be activated for some and not for others?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the way I think of it is more from a science perspective. We talk about flexibility of the brain, flexibility of the mind. And what causes flexibility in the mind are really there are certain circuits in the frontal cortex, for example, that are very important to determine that kind of flexibility. And I think what happens is over time, when we start making a lot of memories, for example, that begins to slow down that kind of flexibility. And so having more and more dependence on memory-based actions is what I think takes us away from the kind of spontaneous, flexible, creative sort of energy that we naturally have. Yeah. So I talk about that in the book. Yeah.
Oh, do you? Oh, perfect. Okay, I didn't realize that. Because I would think that we all have like an anticipatory response. So, for example, if I'm going to sit down in this chair here, I have my anticipation, the response is going to be the chair is going to be there when I sit down. So I think a lot of times we do have that anticipatory response aspect. if someone does something to me or the situation happens, from my past, I was going to say, well, this is what's going to happen. So in that, I don't necessarily realize that I may have other options. And so I'm assuming that's roughly what you're saying as far as the anticipation of what's going to happen, as opposed to what can I do when it does happen.
Absolutely. I mean, we think of the brain as a predictive machine. It's always looking ahead like 5 seconds, as to what's going to happen in the next 5 seconds. And it utilizes all your experiences, all your memory to make those anticipatory predictions. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to, right? So, yeah.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, I don't want to give away all the 4 stages, in your book, because I definitely want my viewers and listeners to purchase the book. But let's transition into your book. The book is called Controlling Mental Chaos, Harnessing the Power of the Creative Mind. What happened for you that you were like, oh my goodness, I need to write this book? What was the impetus for it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I like everyone else, I experienced mental chaos. And for me, it was deep anxieties that I had when I was growing up. I don't know what the cause of those anxieties were, but I had anxieties about just about everything. And in my professional life, it manifested in what's been called imposter syndrome. I was a member of a faculty at a university, and I felt like I didn't belong. How did I ever get to this place? I'm not up to the standards and things like that. So deep anxiety about being myself. And I realized that there were certain things that I could start doing to help that. And so that's when I began the practice, these contemplative practices, meditation, mindfulness. And little by little, I realized that something was changing.
Wow.
And at some point, I got to say, I don't want to be anxious anymore.
Wow.
And getting to that point was kind of interesting. Not that I didn't experience anxiety, but it didn't bother me. It didn't affect me as much after that point. And so, the insights I think that I began to realize is what drove me to write something that could help others.
Yeah. Everyone's going to appreciate you sharing your personal story. It really makes me, I think it's such a powerful statement, though, for you to say, I don't want to experience anxiety anymore. When we think about that, people say, of course, well, I don't want to experience anxiety. But I think when someone experiences it for so long, that becomes ingrained in who they are. That becomes almost their identity in a lot of ways. So to recognize, I don't want to experience this anymore. I don't want that part of my life to have it control me per se. I think it's such a powerful movement, a powerful statement, because you are taking agency, you're taking ownership of, this is my body. The anxiety may influence me, but it's not a part of who I am.
Oh, absolutely. And I think part of what I realized was that I had to forget a lot of things that were in the back of my mind that drove me to that anxiety. And in that forgetting, or as much as possible, set those things aside, I was able to sort of burst through what I thought was the real me, and so yeah.
Wow, that's really neat. I think it's really interesting because we all have so many different ideas of who and what we are, and there's lots of great things. We can look at our persona, what we represent to others, and we can look at our shadow, which is the opposite side of what we show the world. And so, but all that is us, and so we get to determine what side of us is shown and which one we're proud of, which ones we really want to demonstrate who we are. And so sometimes people don't realize that the parts we don't like are part of us, but it also shows you when the darkest side of us can also be the lightest side of us. And so it's learning how to use those different aspects to be able to live a life that's on purpose, or live a life that is fulfilled as well. But before we get started into your book, I wanted to say this real fast. So we talk about chaos here, mental chaos. Chaos has a lot of different terminologies. And so just so everyone's on the same wavelength here, what does mental chaos mean to you, as specific to your book?
Yes. It can be a frightening word, right? I mean, we think of mental chaos as something happening that you have no control over and so forth. Yeah. And it can get to that point. But I think what 80% of us experience is what I would call states of ambiguity. States where we don't know the answer to things. We're searching for an answer to a problem, and we just don't know where to go or how to solve that problem. And so the mind spins and spins. That's the chaos that I'm talking about, and that's what 80% of us experience. So it's a state of ambiguity. I would say it's a state of unknowingness. We don't know the answer. And of course, we're very uncomfortable with not knowing, with uncertainty. And so we sort of jump all over the place trying to figure things out.
Yeah, and I think I could go from moment to moment, and then also farther out in the future. For example, if I for this show right now, if I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do, that can cause that uncertainty or that wavering or
Hmm.
that ambiguity as I'm trying to figure out, shuffle through my questions and my thoughts. Whereas I think if something we have a goal or a plan that seems monumental, we don't know how to do that. I think that also causes that ambiguity as well. And so I think it can be from the moment as well as future activities as well. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one
Yeah.
of the reasons why we're also good at dealing with ambiguity is because we are able to plan ahead, right? And so when you're able to
Hmm.
plan ahead, you have a certain direction that you can go to, and that minimizes that state of not knowingness. But there are
Yeah.
points that we come to when we really don't know things, when we're faced with a
Yeah, that's true.
problem
Yeah.
and we just don't know how to go, A, B, C, or D, and
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
like I said, the mind then begins to spin, and and
Yes.
for me, that state is actually a positive thing. So this is what
Hmm.
comes through in the
Interesting.
book, that instead of seeing chaos as a negative thing,
Uh-huh.
I want to think of it as a positive potential to learn something out of that chaos, out of that
Interesting.
ambiguity.
Hmm.
There's a potential for something new, and so I think of it as a state of creativity that is
Hmm.
unfocused.
Interesting.
So chaos to me is also this
Interesting.
state of the brain is creatively trying to find answers, but it's not able to. And it's a matter of helping it find the right answer, getting to that resolution. So it's an opportunity for growth.
Yeah, I really, really like that. So I think the way I'm hearing that as well is it's just like we have free thoughts. We can write words down or brainstorm. I can see that as chaos being the ability to brainstorm situations. Doesn't mean you're going to work through half of the ideas you come up with, but gives you the opportunity to kind of look at a situation where you have control over it as opposed to it controlling you. I remember it was well, not it's actually pretty recent for me. I went through a really bad loss of something, and I remember as I was grieving through that, I had this epiphany. Yes, this hurts right now. And how exciting is it going to be on the other side of this? So I pivoted my grief to look at the lessons and how I'm going to be on the other side of a situation. And in that, the joy I found from that allowed me to kind of spin it, the chaos, to say, yes, I don't know half the stuff that's going on, but I know how I want to be. And I'm excited how I'm going to be. So it gave me the direction and the goal of how I wanted to go. And as I'm working through that, I find that that's my lodestone or my touchstone rather. And so I think that's one thing people can do as well is to maybe look at the lesson or look at the other side of the situation, whether
Yeah.
it's great or small, to kind of figure out where they want to be, which can kind of, like I said, lead them in their true north.
This is a powerful cognitive strategy that you're familiar with, and we call it reframing, right? Where we
Mm-hmm.
reframe the negativity and look at it from a different perspective and realize that there's
Yeah,
actually opportunity in that. Rather than focusing on the negative, we focus on the positive.
correct.
So it's a matter of reframing, and anybody can do this with your thoughts because they're basically just thoughts.
Yes.
To reframe things, to look at it, and so a lot of creative individuals, for example, they see problems as opportunities, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is
Yeah.
what makes them creative individuals, right? They realize that there's a potential to learn something new, to go forward, et cetera. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And well, you look at all the different entrepreneurs and inventors, there's a problem in the world and they figure out how to solve it. So in
Right.
that, they take that chaos and then they solve it and all of a sudden they make millions of dollars, which is great.
There you go.
Is this book, Controlling Mental Chaos, Harnessing the Power of the Creative Mind? Is this a workbook or academic book? What kind of book is it?
It's a self-help book. That's how I
Okay.
structured it, right, in my
Uh,
mind. But because I bring my science background and my personal
uh,
perspective, it's a combination of both, right? So it's got the self-help aspect to it, but it's got the science. If you're interested in knowing what is it that's changing in your brain when you make that reframing, we know a
that's
lot
powerful.
about the cognitive aspects of that.
Hmm.
So I talked a
The
little bit
thoughts of it. Yeah.
about that, but I also have. Uh, I suggest a number of things that people can do to get them from the uncontrolled
Interesting.
mind to the more controlled mind. Yeah. So
You
that
know,
aspect, the
with the
self.
process, yeah,
Sorry.
perfect. With the process of that, of getting to that creative mind, I know you said in your book you have the four unique steps that you talk about, and I don't want to necessarily go into the specifics of it, but to go from that controlled chaos to finding that calmness and stillness, that happens, and then all of a sudden chaos happens again. How does your book, or how do you help people continue to maintain that ability to stay in more of that creative, peace-filled, or more controlled state, or of ordered state rather than go into the chaos, because it's going to continue to swirl all the time?
Right. So the basic foundational error I think that the mind makes is that it's so dependent on prior actions. And so I call creativity controlled chaos. Creativity controlled
Okay.
chaos. And so how do we go from uncontrolled aspects to the more creative control aspect? And what I think it is that the mind during the uncontrolled aspect is depending too much on what it did before, on prior experiences. And so it spins and spins because those prior experiences don't help you break through the problem. And so what you need to do is set those aside, set those memories aside, reduce your dependency on the past or on predictions on the future, and be sort of centered in the present. And I think that that's part of the key. How do you go from uncontrolled to controlled? Center yourself in the present. And then it bypasses those memories. And we know from science that that is the case. When you're living in the moment, you're bypassing what are called autobiographical memories, accessing those biographical memories, which are, giving you this dependence on the past. So that's one aspect of it.
Perfect. And I'm wondering, though, if we can look at the past in the sense of the situation may be different, but the emotions that we're currently experiencing may be very similar to things that have happened in the past. Could we focus on the past things that we did to work through that emotion to bring us to a place of stillness, and not necessarily the cause of the chaos, but looking at what were the actionable steps I took? For example, for me experiencing grief, if I can look back on previous grief-filled situations and say, what did I do that worked for me to help me work through this? And what did I do that didn't help me, work through this? But I can use those techniques to bring me to my center today to be able to help me in the future. Is that something people can do
absolutely.
as well?
I'm not arguing that we totally give up the past. We learn from the past, and we need to extract those lessons in order to move forward. So that's absolutely necessary. So yeah, absolutely. Utilizing it appropriately, though.
Of course. That's the key word, appropriate. I think sometimes we forget, we get lost and re-traumatized by the past situation, and then all of a sudden our grief is compounded. So of course, I really appreciate you saying that as well. Yes. Now, when it comes to being centered, people have, I've seen movies, people are like, I'm centered now. I know it's a joke, but what are ways in which we specifically can be centered to stay present in the moment? Because, our mind can have what's called a cognitive drift, where we're, our mind wavers and thinks about many different things. Or we have different aspects that just pull us out of that being centered. What are specific ways in which a person can stay centered to be able to start controlling their mental chaos?
Yeah, no, and I like to start by just saying that meditation is really the training of attention. You're training how to be attentive, but there are varieties of attention. One is focused attention. And this is the tendency that we have in our culture, is to utilize focused attention way too much. But there's another aspect of attention, which is called open awareness, which is more of the undivided attention, where you look at things, you're looking at a beautiful sunset and you're simply experiencing that beauty, without saying anything, analyzing it, whatever. That's an aspect of attention that we don't cultivate in our culture, this open awareness. And so I think when we say living in the moment, living in the present, I'm talking about accessing that open awareness type of attention, where you open yourself up, you have no filters, you let things in, but you try not to analyze, not to judge, you're just simply experiencing these things. Yeah.
And I think that's very difficult for a lot of people because, go ahead.
No.
I would think that that'd be difficult for a lot of people in the sense of, because we have so much stimuli, so much technology, et cetera, that it can be hard for people not to pass judgment, not to focus specifically, hone in on one specific aspect of perhaps that sunset. Are there ways in which, as we are aware of this, is it our five senses we use to help us be open to our environment, or is it more something internal, more spiritual to help us stay focused like that? How would you kind of differentiate between the five senses versus the internal self?
Yeah, I don't think there's a difference in my mind. I mean, I think the five senses are the channels that let in the energy from the outside,
Sure.
and then there's an internal energy that interacts with that external energy, and it's the combination of of those two things that leads us to our experiences, right? And you're right, absolutely right. The world is such that we're distracted by all sorts of things. So the recommendation is always to take a moment, a quiet place where you can start practicing this stuff, because you don't want to be interrupted by all this. But the more you practice, the more you realize that you can actually do it any place. In the middle of a storm, as the Zen Buddhists say, you can be calm in the middle of a storm, but you have to practice. That's the thing. And so you start basically in a place, sitting down quietly and trying to do this practice. Yeah.
Yes. And the finding that quietude and stillness in the storm, many times people don't really understand that. And because, it's a storm, of course you have to be all frenetic and have to be like, but to recognize that when we find that quietude, that is our strength. And in that strength comes our ability to overcome any obstacle we may face. And it kind of goes back to maybe some of that resilience as well. Recognizing that we all have the resilience, whether it's been activated to certain levels or not. But the point is, it's there. And so I think your book, Controlling Mental Chaos, Harnessing the Power of the Creative Mind, probably what will really help people recognize their agency, their ability to find that stillness, to find their ability to find the resilience to be able to overcome any obstacle they may face as well. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity for them to read this.
Yes, thank you. And and just to reemphasize that this ability is something that is innate in us. I mean, we have that ability, right? It's just that we don't cultivate it, we don't practice it, and so we need to pay attention to it and practice it. But it's there. It's not something you need to learn. It's innate in you.
Yeah, it's there. And I think it's kind of interesting. Even thinking more so about that, like. So in the chaos, once again, gives us the opportunity to practice resilience. And so I think the recognition of, just like you said, we don't practice it enough. If we recognize that, I don't like this chaos, but I can practice what resilience means for me. And in that we become more empowered, more strengthened. And so therefore we can get to the other side of it. So, I think it all works together from the first question I asked you about the resilience to, as we wrap up here as well. It's kind of cool.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So unfortunately, our time is up. You and I could talk about this all day. I mean, I could tell I'm speaking more quickly now as I get more excited about it. But Dr. Jaime Pineda, if my viewers and listeners want to find out more information about you and to purchase your book, Controlling Mental Chaos, Harnessing the Power of the Creative Mind, where will they find all this information online?
So it's the book is sold on Amazon and in Barnes and Noble, and I have a website called theunencumberedmind.com that people can go to and buy it.
Awesome. Okay. My viewers and listeners also know that if you can't find this information any other place, simply go to the show notes at jamesmillerlifeology.com and link with Dr. Jaime Pineda and his book, one more time, Controlling Mental Chaos, Harnessing the Power of the Creative Mind. Thank you once again. I appreciate all your knowledge and wisdom.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.